that moment, you know, the one, you get an email, maybe. Maybe it's a calendar invite for a mandatory community building session.
Oh, yeah.
They promise connection, belonging, all of that. They'll even use phrases like soft rectangles of intention. And before you've even walked into that room, your body just, it tightens, your shoulders lift. And there's this deep, preemptive exhaustion.
A sense of inevitability.
Exactly. This is going to cost you something significant. Okay, let's unpack this. Because for a lot of people, and especially for those whose nervous systems work a bit differently, what our source material calls autistic or gestalt processors, that feeling, that immediate tightening, it's not just, you know, social anxiety.
Right. It's something else.
It's the body recognizing a structural demand that's just wrapped up in this really friendly language of care. It's a systemic mismatch, and it registers immediately.
It's an accurate reading of force.
Yeah, that's it. So our mission today is a deep dive into this really insightful analysis that actually names this phenomenon quiet violence.
Right.
We want to dissect how these good intentions can end up neutralizing power dynamics and lead to this deep cumulative harm.
Harm that leaves, as the source says, no bruise, no raised voice.
Right. Why does mandatory vulnerability feel so much like extraction?
And I think what's really crucial for you to grasp right from the get-go is this idea of pattern literacy.
Pattern literacy, okay.
Yeah. So autistic and gestalt systems, they don't typically wait for sequential instructions. They don't need the bullet points to understand a space.
They're not reading the agenda.
Not first, anyway. They process information all at once. They recognize fields. They're reading pressure. They're reading history. They're reading power long before they register the promises being made.
That is such a vital distinction. So it's not about the words. It's about the context of the words.
Exactly. They process what the situation does.
What it does.
Yeah. How are the bodies positioned? How is silence held when someone hesitates? How does power move without being named? They process all of that before they process what the situation is called.
So by the time the facilitator is all smiles, saying, welcome, this is a safe space.
Yeah, sure. The nervous system has already run a totally different and frankly often a far more accurate structural analysis of the room. It's just reacting to the actual risk, not the declared risk.
And that accurate perception that leads us right to the problem, doesn't it? The fracture of safety. It matters so much to name it quiet violence, because if you don't name the structure, the reaction just gets dismissed. It becomes an individual flaw.
And it becomes you're too sensitive.
You have an attitude problem or a tone problem. It just erases all the structural forces that are at play.
And we really have to clarify the difference between discomfort and harm here, because they're not the same thing.
Not at all.
Discomfort, you know, as the sources point out, it can be part of growth, but it usually comes with choice.
Right. And context.
And the ability to opt out without being penalized for it. Harm, on the other hand, that happens when systems remove those safeguards. Autonomy, clarity, protection.
Okay, so if I choose to stand up and speak at a voluntary conference, that's discomfort.
That's your choice.
But if I am compelled, forced, to discuss my personal life in a mandatory meeting to satisfy some metric of team fit.
It's not about comfort anymore.
That's something else entirely.
Precisely. In these mandatory settings where you're pressured to disclose and then just left alone to manage the fallout, the issue stops being comfort and it becomes straight up safety.
And the source material breaks this down. It talks about 5 key layers of safety.
Yeah, and neurodivergent nervous systems crack these incredibly closely, and these sessions they systemically dismantle them.
Let's spend a minute on those 5 because they really define the boundary of consent at work, don't they?
Absolutely. And the system is tracking all of them at the same time. So first, there's autonomy.
Can I choose to participate or not?
Or is refusal basically impossible? Second is boundary clarity. Do I know where the edges are?
Or are they just constantly shifting?
Right. Third, consent. Is it real? Is it meaningful? Or is it just symbolic? A check-the-box exercise.
And fourth, predictability. Can I anticipate what I'm going to be asked?
Or am I just walking into an ambush?
Wow.
And the last one, which is maybe the most critical in any hierarchy.
Is power symmetry.
Exactly. Power symmetry.
Yeah.
What are the real, actual consequences if I say no? If I choose to pass? And in these sessions, because one party, the institution, holds all the power of evaluation,
that symmetry is gone. Instant.
It's broken. So when even one of those layers fractures, the nervous system has to compensate. But when several of them fracture at once, which is, let's be honest, the norm in these settings, the cost just skyrockets.
And this is why the response, the panic, the shutdown, the meltdown, it is not a sign of fragility.
No.
It's a completely coherent, rational response to a structurally unsound environment. It's just what happens when a system is forced to operate inside all this ambiguity and coercion with no safe way out.
Individually, you can navigate a lack of predictability once in a while,
Sure.
but when all five pile up collectively and your job is attached to your participation, they're not manageable frustrations anymore. They form a trap.
And that trap that leads us right into the most coercive part of these meetings.
Mm-hmm.
Enforced vulnerability as extraction.
Mm-hmm.
We see it everywhere now, right? This idea that openness is some kind of moral good for professionals. But what happens if you refuse?
Your silence is red.
Yeah, your silence carries this implied risk. The language is so gentle, but the institutional pressure is anything but.
And that's the critical part. True vulnerability, when it's chosen, can be amazing. It can be connective.
Of course.
But when it's compelled by mandatory attendance or by these aggressive group norms, it stops being vulnerability. It just becomes extraction. And for autistic and gestalt processors, the source shows this cost it's profound. It's deeply physical.
What's fascinating here is the distinction the sources make between sharing a story and activating a field. Can you unpack that for us?
Certainly. So for a lot of sequential processors, a story is. It's like a tidy verbal thing. You open the file, you share the summary, and then you close it. It's neat.
Right.
For Gestalt processors, that's often not how it works at all. Sharing a short reflection can mean opening an entire memory field, a huge interconnected sensory thing that lives in body states, in emotions, in sensory input.
So it's not a 5-minute story. It's activating an entire database of lived experience.
Exactly. And the system has to use immense energy just to stabilize and contain that activation. And crucially, that field does not just neatly close when the facilitator says, okay, next person.
Wow.
What looks light and momentary on the outside is almost never light on the inside.
And then there's the long-term problem of narrative ownership. Once that story is out there, where does it go? Information in a workplace is almost never neutral.
It's never neutral. It moves up, it moves sideways, and it becomes what the sources call narrative residue.
Narrative residue. I like that.
Yeah. So a comment you shared in a vulnerable moment, maybe about struggling with work-life balance, can be remembered later, out of context. It gets folded into assessments of your fit, your resilience.
Your professionalism.
Exactly. Long after the session, the person who shared loses all control over how that sensitive information gets held and used by the institution.
And that lack of containment means the nervous system has to shift into a survival mode just to manage this coercive intimacy. The sources point to 3 pretty common and totally intelligible ways people try to survive.
They're rational adaptations. They're not failures. First, there's hypervigilance, which is just scanning every single word, every facial expression for safety cues. You're trying to anticipate the next demand. It's exhausting but necessary labor.
And second,
shutdown. The system just conserves energy. It might look like someone's staring blankly, but it's actually a desperate attempt to reduce sensory input and just wait for the demand to pass.
And the third one often looks like the total opposite, but it's the one that causes so much pain afterwards.
That's the freeze flood response. The pressure to connect is just so high that the person overshares. They flood the room with way too much personal detail just to satisfy the demand and get out of the spotlight.
They get temporary relief.
But they pay for it later, in exhaustion, cognitive fog, or just this deep sense of collapse from having, violently transgressed their own boundaries.
And this whole dynamic, it's totally asymmetrical. What's framed as mutual sharing. We're all vulnerable here. It isn't mutual at all, is it?
Not even close. The institution, by declaring the space vulnerable, gets to absorb the appearance of humanity without taking any actual risk itself.
Yeah.
Instead, it puts all the emotional labor onto the individuals to make the room function. What gets called sharing becomes unpaid effective labor. They are literally taking emotional work that belongs in a relationship and framing it as a mandatory job contribution.
And if that wasn't enough, then we get to pseudo-intimacy, this huge boundary collapse. It's where closeness is just aggressively performed. You use the rituals of trust-sharing circles, deep listening.
But without the foundation. Without this slow work of relationship and history that has to be underneath it.
And that lack of foundation is what's so destabilizing.
It is. Autistic systems track actual relational depth. So when an institution just announces intimacy by fiat, okay, from now on, we are a community, now share, the system just registers this profound contradiction.
You can't mandate closeness.
You cannot skip the long, complex work that makes closeness meaningful.
And that missing scaffolding is why it feels like a trespass.
Yes.
Work colleagues who are bound by roles and hierarchy and contracts are suddenly supposed to be a community. They're asked to hold each other's trauma, maybe.
Without any reciprocal responsibility or the ability to step out of that role when the session is over. It's depth without durability. Intimacy without a real, durable relationship. It feels like trespass because the boundaries are being quietly but fundamentally dismantled.
Right, the emotional content is invited in.
But the structural protection you need to hold that content is just gone.
Which leads directly to that ambiguity fracture, the casual assurance of choice.
Ah, yes. You can pass if you want.
It looks like respect for autonomy. But when refusal is so undefined and unprotected, that choice becomes incredibly ambiguous. It's the classic double bind.
It is. If the facilitator doesn't explicitly commit and protect that commitment, that not participating won't be noted or interpreted, it forces this continuous, complex, real-time calculation from the nervous system.
So you're left just calculating, is passing really okay? Or is it just being tolerated while someone makes a mental note for later?
Right. So the individual gets saddled with this impossible cognitive load. Both options are risky. Speaking risks overexposure and that narrative residue we talked about.
But silence invites judgment about your attitude or your commitment.
The theoretical choice just deepens the trap. It shifts all the responsibility onto you for navigating the ambiguity. The system overloads because it's compensating for missing structural information.
So the institution gets to keep its flexibility. The facilitator never has to say, your silence will be judged.
It's enough that it might be judged. When refusal is permitted but not protected, it isn't consent, it's compliance theater.
Compliance theater, wow, that phrase, it perfectly captures the energy drain. And this whole thing unfolds inside a mandatory workplace context, which means there's this massive asymmetrical power dynamic just hanging over the room.
Always. Attendance is required. Yeah. Evaluation is implicit.
The contradiction of voluntary sharing inside compulsory structures is just impossible to ignore.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, remember, gestalt processors track patterns across time. They don't see this session as an isolated event. They read the history of every room just like it.
So in that context?
In that context, the possibility of a clean, consequence-free refusal just vanishes. There is no true no. That doesn't also become data. Silence is data. Participation is overinterpreted data. Nothing just evaporates when the timer goes off.
And that feeling of having no exit, that structural lack of escape, that's what triggers the entrapment response.
Yeah.
The panic.
Which is, as we said, a rational signal, not dysregulation. But on top of that, there is this other layer of emotional labor disguised as community.
Right.
The room only feels functional or even slightly warm because specific people, often neurodivergent people socialized to mend things, are absorbing all the instability.
They're holding the awkward silence.
They're softening the tension when a prompt lands badly. They're offering gentle bridges so the whole process can just sputter forward.
So they're basically performing the emotional regulation for the entire room so the institutional process doesn't just collapse.
Exactly. And this is work. It requires massive, often painful, energy and self-suppression, and it is never, ever named as labor or compensated. It is the extraction of regulation itself. You see community rituals being used to replace genuine structural change.
And even silence itself gets weaponized, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. It's often framed as, reverence or deep reflection. But functionally, it's often a surveillance demand. You're not invited to rest. You are expected to perform the appearance of reflection.
Which is an impossible demand for so many. If self-regulation for an autistic person requires looking away or closing down sensory channels,
those necessary survival strategies are immediately misread as resistance. Disengagement, attitude. So the pause just increases the load instead of restoring capacity.
Which brings us to the global failure. The panic isn't a response to one awkward prompt. It's the entire system sounding an alarm.
It's been asked to do too much with too little safety and too little autonomy for too long.
And the aftermath, the cognitive fog, the delayed meltdown days later. It might seem disproportionate, but it's a completely coherent response to a situation where your autonomy has been reduced to just performance.
And we have to just say this plainly, based on the analysis. This is fundamentally not a social skills problem.
Right.
It is structural misattunement. Autistic distress in these settings isn't confusion. It is accurate perception of structural harm.
And that accurate perception reveals the ethical failure at the core, which is that harm is being actively reframed as connection.
And coercion is being renamed as care.
Calling something community building doesn't make it communal, does it? Intent doesn't determine impact. True community requires, what, three non-negotiable things?
Voluntary presence.
Real relationship built over time.
And power symmetry.
Without those, the session is just compliance softened by sentiment. Or, to use that brilliant phrase again, intimacy aesthetics without consent.
This raises an important question then. The ethical choice for institutions when they mandate these rooms, it's actually pretty simple. It draws a very clear line.
Okay.
We have to ask, is the vulnerability being genuinely chosen and actively protected by the institution? Or is it being extracted to serve some organizational metric?
They can either provide the safety or be honest about what they're taking.
Exactly. If an institution is unwilling to provide that protection and power symmetry and real consent, then it has to at least be honest about the cost of the information it is taking.
Because when neurodivergent people panic in these rooms, it's not because they can't connect.
No, it's because they can connect. And they know exactly what piece of themselves they're being asked to give up and to whom. It is a calculated, rational attempt to save the self from extraction.